One of the things that we always do is we cover the legislation that was passed in the past General Assembly session, and we try to target it to being related to planning and zoning and things that in your locality you may have to look at for the July 1 start date, that you may need to do some code amendments or things to prepare for. That being said, what we don't talk about is any of the really terrible bills that got killed or carried over, and that's where a lot of energy does go, but we don't really talk about that. So this year was a fairly unexciting year for legislation related to planning and zoning, with the exception of the bill that Jonah mentioned earlier, House Bill 1849. And we spent a very large amount of time working with VACO, VML, a lot of partners on that to try and do what we could to, because the original bill, believe it or not, was way worse than what got adopted if you've looked at it. And so a lot of work and energy went into that. Meanwhile, I'm not going to talk about it. Greg is, and I think he'll do a great job later. So that really condensed what I had to share with you guys today. So I tried to include things that were interesting as well as things that impact specifically land use and zoning. So far, so good. I always start with some of the same beginning things, so if you've been to this presentation before and heard me, then you know some of this, but it's for multiple reasons, and really the main is there's CM credits available for this, so we have to hit certain targets. So I'm just going to touch on those before we jump into the bills. Jonah already introduced me. I am Vice President of Legislative and Policy Affairs for APA Virginia. That's how I get to come and speak to you guys, and I really appreciate it, and so does the chapter. I've been doing that. I was elected in 2012, and I think my term's up next year, so you guys will get someone new shortly. I did start as the planning director for Montgomery County in January of this year, and I serve as a regional director for Plan Virginia, and Jonah also gave a little bit of information about that. You know, for 60 years, they've been helping educate citizens related to planning and zoning, and we feel very proud of that. I also like to make sure that you guys know about legislative resources, just in case you are even a little bit as excited about policy and legislation as I am, and you just want to keep in touch with what's going on. The chapter has a new website, planning.org Chapters Virginia is where we're now housed. And I know that several of you have actually contacted me over the past year since that changed to say my bookmark doesn't work anymore. So that's where you can find it. And then policy, /policy is where you can find our publications and our bill tracking during the session. And so we're going to talk about this publication, our key bills for planners. The final one went up online 2 weeks ago. This is what we'll use today as a resource. Jonah will have a link directly to this also on the Plan Virginia page. We also keep an item there that we refer to as the toolkit, and that has to do with all of the tools that you have as planners and planning commissioners and even boards to regulate land use in your locality. Even though Richmond tries to take some of those away every year, it seems like, there are still lots of resources available, and it's a go-to item that we produce each year for our members, but we also share it with the public. One of the things we do every year is when the General Assembly session starts and we go to Senate local government and county, cities, and towns, which are the two subcommittees we work with the most, we have a printed bound version of that we hand out at those first meetings so that we know that they have that resource readily available. We don't give them a disc, we don't give them a link, because it's hard enough for those of us who care about it to go and use that. We give them that publication so that hopefully they'll use it. And actually, in the years that I've been doing this, we're surprised to see that several of them do use it, and they'll contact us because our information's on there and say, tell me more about cash proffers. I don't understand impact fees. And that's really been a good gateway for us. I did mention earlier we partner with VACO and VML on a lot of items, and they have very robust legislative programs too. So if you go to their websites and look at legislative, they have their own bill summaries out that are more broad than what we're going to talk about today. They get into all the local government issues, finance and budget, those sort of things. And again, very active committees, very robust programs. And just in case you like to know what's going on with national policy, I put the APA national website up. There's a blog there. They have planning guides that come out from national. So if you have a topic that you're dealing with in your locality, you can go there, and sometimes there will be an adopted policy guide that deals with that. We recently adopted a hazard mitigation one. We're in the process of updating the Sustainable Development Policy Guide, but there's tons of them out there, and they're resources for planners all over the country. So it's just important to know that that's there. And finally, the other item I always share with you guys is we're going to talk about legislative code changes this year. Those are the actions through the General Assembly. They provide the statutory authority for the changes in the administrative code, VAC. And all of us who are used to dealing with state agencies, a lot of times you notice that VAC code number, that can get modified year round. And if it's something that you're interested in, if you go to townhallvirginia.gov, you can get a great email every morning that tells you everything that's going on in the world of Town Hall Virginia Administrative Code. So in case you're a legislative junkie, I hope that sort of gets you ready for the rest of the day. And I tried to make these very close together, so hopefully no one gets seasick. But this is all new for me. We're going to start with energy and environment. Jonah touched on this in his opening remarks, which wasn't planned at all. But we're going to see some common themes in the bills that I do talk about, and energy is one of them. All over the state, we're having energy issues of different scales and different calibers, and many of us work in jurisdictions where they're talking about pipelines and things like that. And this year, because of some of that discussion, I think it brought forward some things in the General Assembly to say, if we're not for this, then what can we be for, and how can we do things? So the first was the bills, HB 2267 and Senate Bill 1099, which establishes the Virginia Solar Energy Development Authority. And this is pretty exciting because this group is charged with those items there specific to what Virginia can do to make it easier to use solar, get solar out to folks. So it's a pretty progressive bill for Richmond, and I think that it will hopefully serve us well. There's also a change this year with the non-residential net metering programs. The max capacity was increased to, I think, a full megawatt, where before it was like a half. And that's on non-residential. If you have some of that, it's worth taking a look at that bill. And then I didn't know that there was a green job tax credit. Did you guys know about this? But it got extended. It was set to expire in January of this year. And the green job tax credits, I looked it up, it's actually for businesses. If you create green jobs, and the qualifying means it has to be a job that altogether with salary and fringe is over $50,000 a year, you get an associated tax credit for that, and you're allowed to create up to something like 350 jobs and receive a tax credit. So I think that's really a positive thing that the state has done, and it's also very positive that it was set to expire this year and they extended it through 2019. So that's just something that's out there for anyone who's looking at economic development options. I think that's a really positive thing. Waste was a huge topic this year too, and that was due to some things that were going on, I think, in the central part of the state related specifically to industrial waste. So it's really interesting what they did. They had these bills for solid and semi-solid industrial waste. Localities are allowed to adopt ordinances requiring testing and monitoring. So not prohibiting or regulating in any way, but you can require testing and monitoring. And then DEQ is supposed to establish a fee structure and establish a training program for locality staff who is now dealing with this potentially new use in their locality. So this is something that really was new this session and kind of came out of an actual existing case, and it really started the discussion. So you'll see that the other items are these joint resolutions. The first is a study of the long-term impacts of this application of biosolids and industrial waste. And both VIMS, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, and DMME, Departments of Mine, Minerals, and Energy, are charged with doing that study. And then the second was creating a task force. And the language is kind of interesting here. The task force is supposed to review and evaluate existing scientific literature, so not new stuff, but what's out there existing on the impacts of biosolids and industrial waste applications. And that consists of the secretaries of Ag, Natural Resources, and Health and Human Resources. So we've got some studies in the works. We've got the task force set up, and I think that that's a really good step for this session. You know, it was You notice that they didn't let us start regulating it, but they did sort of start the conversation. So we'll see what happens in the future with those. Water resources, another huge theme for this year, and I'll go ahead and just sort of bring that up. A big reason that people are talking about water, other than, for the reasons that we just normally do, is in last session, they set up the General Assembly set up a recurrent flooding subcommittee. And I don't know if you guys have heard about this group, but it's a 2-year subcommittee, so they'll actually be reporting out in the coming session. And this group has been doing some real work. They have been meeting aggressively and really talking about stormwater, groundwater, recurrent flooding, and all of these items that obviously impact Tidewater and Chesapeake Bay region, but also other parts of the state, that have their own flooding issues. So because of that conversation being started, even though they don't report out of the committee until next year, we had several bills that got in the queue and got carried this year because of that. And I think that's overall a pretty positive thing. The first was just sort of a cleanup. We used to have a lot of language in the text regarding tributary plans or trib strategies, things like that. If you work in a Chesapeake Bay locality, you're probably pretty familiar with that. That's been replaced over the years with WIPs, watershed implementation plans, and so they did just some text cleanup. So if you're used to looking and that not being consistent, this is a change that handles the consistency for that. House Bill 1734 is specific to living shorelines, and it sets up a loan program for localities to get the loan to implement living shoreline applications. So that's sort of an interesting first step too. Maybe that will eventually be expanded. Maybe localities have to be the agents for projects. We'll see how that goes. But this sets up sort of a low interest loan program for that. The other item, another new thing, I didn't know that Virginia had a flood protection plan, but we do. And these bills said that there has to be regular updates of that plan. So we like that. That's pretty good. And that it has to be made available online. So this is in the purview of DCR. And this bill basically said, update this plan, keep it updated, and make it readily available for the citizens of the Commonwealth. So I think that's a pretty positive thing too, especially for people who already knew it existed, because I didn't. And then House Bill 1924 and Senate Bill 1341, they established an Eastern Virginia Groundwater Management Advisory Committee, and that's for the existing Eastern Virginia Groundwater Management Area. And it has to do with basically some of the regulations that were going to take place regarding applications and the restrictions of withdrawal. This committee is charged with kind of taking a look at what makes sense, because there's a lot of things to balance here. Some of these water withdrawals are very closely tied to economic development, which we're all in favor of. But if you're using more groundwater than what's your share, how is it impacting people with wells and other economic development? And so this is a huge conversation going on right now, statewide, but specific to some of the eastern state. You've got these huge withdrawal sources in West Point, Isle of Wight's coming back online, and so places like those paper mills are doing a lot of groundwater withdrawal. You're seeing subsidence, and you're seeing potential impacts to wells residentially in the area. So there's just tons of conversation going on, and I wouldn't be surprised if next year we see more regulation related to groundwater, because the state's starting to really pay attention to that. And for those of us who do land use and have been doing it for a while, groundwater really was just something that, oh, well, you can get a well, and it was sort of like just assumed that you could. And now they're really starting to think about what the capacity is and how that impacts us. So that committee right now is tied to Eastern Virginia. It deals with some of those larger aquifers, and there's going to be some creative stuff that comes out of this. I can tell you one of the discussions that's already in place is there a way to do sort of an injection? Can we recharge the aquifer ourselves? Some of these really creative things to try to balance that economic development and also, protect citizens and existing wells and things like that. Yes, sir. If your locality has a Eastern Virginia groundwater management area, if it had to adopt something in the last couple of years, then you're in that area. I can't give you the exact, but I could probably pull it up later and share. I don't think it's specifically tied to like Ches Bay or east of 95. I think I-State's still chilling. Okay. I don't know exactly how it looks out, but I'm sure there's a map available for it. Sorry. And then there's more water. So this was really a theme. People are talking about all things water, groundwater, surface water. The first is not technically a water. It's tied to erosion and sediment control, which is about water quality overall. It exempts certain VDOT projects, routine maintenance projects, from erosion and sediment control. And this is consistent with the same exemption that they gave VDOT for stormwater. So I just thought this was really interesting, especially because we're all dealing with our own stormwater issues across the state. That stormwater exemption already exists, and now there's this exemption for E&S, and that's supposed to be for routine highway maintenance. So that may be something that you come across as you're working on projects in your locality. The first joint resolution that I have here is a DEQ study to impact stormwater post-development technical criteria if you're in a locality that has a seasonally high water table. Because of the new stormwater regulations and some of the stuff we've gone through in the past few years, it didn't touch on much related to stormwater. It's a little bit like transportation that we're going to talk about in a second. They kind of want to see what it's going to do. They kind of want to see how things are going to flesh out. So this study is specific to seasonally high water table areas and to do some studying to look at how these post-development technical criteria are functioning, if they're doing what they need to be doing or if there needs to be some adjustment. The second study is joint resolution for a JLARC study, and that's specific to water resource planning and management of groundwater and surface water. So tons of conversation in Richmond this year about water. And then the last item I have here is interesting. It's a change to the Residential Property Disclosure Act. It basically says the owner or the owner's agent doesn't have to tell you anything about flooding, but should encourage a potential purchaser to look at firm maps, look at flood maps, talk to people who do mortgages, talk to people who do flood insurance. It basically uses that phrase, advise the potential purchaser to exercise due diligence. So I don't know what it actually does, but they got some language in, and I guess it's a good first step. One of the things we wanted to do with the chapter this year was to take a look at disclosures related to if the property had experienced repetitive flooding, because that's not something that has to be disclosed right now. And we feel like that's something that a potential purchaser should know about and be able to have that, in their sort of due diligence phase of looking at properties. We haven't given up on that, but it's hard to get traction for it because we end up having to work with the realtors, and we're not always on the same side of every issue. I'm sure that doesn't come as a surprise to most of you. But actually, in the realtors that we've talked to, and those are associated with the Realtors Association, they look at it pretty favorably. So there could be more to come. That's one of the items we're going to continue to work on for 2016, is taking a look at what can be done to make sure people know if the property they're looking at is a repetitive flood property. So more to come. We'll see how that goes. Ethics reform, I'm just going to touch on this a little bit, and I put a little asterisk in here to remind me. I always say this at the beginning, but I had a feeling I'd forget. I'm not an attorney, and most importantly, I'm not your local government attorney. On all of these issues, I encourage you to make notes and go back to your locality and talk to your local government attorney about how it impacts you and what their view is and how they want to change or not change things. In case anyone didn't follow the news this year, we had a lot of discussion about the governor's office and things related to gift amounts and what needs to be disclosed. So there was some language that got adopted this year specific to General Assembly members and what their new requirements are going to be. And if that's something that you're interested in, I encourage you to look the bills up. They're in the key bills report, but because they don't impact our localities, I just sort of kind of just put that in there and glossed over. What does impact local governments are two things. The first I found really interesting because no longer can state and local government employees use retaliation. So You cannot use a public position to retaliate or threaten retaliation against those expressing their views on matters of public concerns or for exercising any right that's protected by law. I hope a lot of us weren't doing that already. But if you were, get it out of your system before July 1, because starting July 1, you're not going to be allowed to do that anymore. That was just pretty interesting. It's an interesting bill to read, and I put the other asterisk there. It does not deal with the existing authority. So probably where you work already has some things in place to deal with people who aren't behaving themselves and how people get removed and things like that, or reprimanded. This doesn't usurp that. It just makes it illegal to do so. So interesting text there, and I thought I'd give you guys the heads up that July 1, we gotta be on the lookout for that. Senate Bill 1424 talks a little bit about changes in disclosures and related forms for conflict of interest. And that basically, what it boils down to, because the bill is lengthier than obviously the little blurb I have there, but what it boils down to, and this was something that I think VML and BACO worked on also, local bodies will continue to file with your local courts. So if you're a planning commissioner, or if you manage a planning commission or a board of supervisors, they have to do a disclosure form every year. And there was an agency, a group that was set up to review these statewide, and General Assembly members will have to submit to that group. There was a push to have local government folks submit to that group also. And VACO and BML were like, I don't know that this is really necessary. We haven't done anything wrong. This is kind of over the top. And so eventually that was worked down, and the text says that local bodies will continue to file probably with your local board clerk is who usually processes those. So that's not a change from what we're used to doing, but it almost was. So that's kind of an example of what goes on during the 45 or 60 days that we're in session. And you can't talk about Conflict of Interest Act without going into freedom of information. The first item, Senate Bill 969, is really, I think, a useful piece of legislation, and I don't say that a whole lot. But one of the things is it talks about open meetings. So just because a public body has 2 or more people in the same room does not mean that it's an open meeting. You know, especially in a lot of smaller localities, you could easily have the same Board of Supervisors members. T-ball team. I mean, it was starting to really need this clarification. So planning commissioners and Board of Supervisors who happen to be in the same room or at the same event, as long as they're not doing business, that's always, you know, the key, the trigger there. As long as they're not talking work and trying to shop at the T-ball game, it's not an open meeting. There's no freedom of information breach there. But this goes into that a little bit, and I think it's worth taking a look at. The second item, Senate Bill 1109, that I have there, expands open meeting exemptions. And if you look at the language, this is really tied to security, threats of terrorism, things like that. If you need to go into closed session, or your board, more importantly, needs to go into closed session to talk about what you're doing to keep a public building safe, some of the things that you might be doing to sort of fortify, you're now allowed to do that and not worry about being in closed session to do so, and whether it qualifies. So that's an interesting change this year that is sort of noteworthy and worth talking about, because we always sort of, you know, you have to certify why you went into closed session, and this sort of expands on what that's allowed for. Okay. Land preservation kind of seemed to be under attack this year. I'm not really sure why. We didn't know where a lot of this language came from, and a lot of it sailed right through. The first item is related to land use valuation taxation. How many of your localities use land use taxation as a resource? A lot of Virginia localities do, and sometimes it's in combination with other preservation type items, purchase of development rights, things like that. But up until this year, in order to even qualify for that program, you were supposed to, although I heard some people didn't, have at least 5 acres. And that has now been changed. It can be smaller than 5 acres and be part of land use. I encourage each of you who, see this change to talk to not only your staff but your Commissioner of Revenue and your board about how this may or may not impact you guys. If This says that you're allowed to go less than. It doesn't say that you have to. And we know that commissioners of revenue kind of run their own show. So, it may be different in your own locality, but this sort of put that language in there. The second item is both House Bill 1828 and Senate Bill 1019, land preservation tax credit reduction. I encourage you to take a look at this. I tried to just bullet a couple of things, but it's somewhat startling to people who work in the realm of land preservation. The first was, starting this year, the maximum amount was taken from $100 million to $75 million. And for your claim, the maximum amount starting this year and carrying into next year goes from $100,000 to $20,000. And then in taxable years moving forward, they've bumped it back up to $50,000. I don't know if this is going to stay on the books. There's definitely a lot of people who this got conversation started, caught a lot of people off guard. There may be some organizations that come forward and try to really look at this in the coming year. Something that's interesting is, I think it was last session or it might have been the session before, the General Assembly asked a committee to take a look at all of the tax credits we offer in Virginia, because we have a pretty robust amount of tax credits if you take a look at it, and there's a easily available link online to go and look them up. We offer quite a few. And what they did is they looked at all of them and really didn't recommend any changes or anything. They kind of just said, yep, we've got a lot, and kind of, moved on. This came out this year, and we're not sure if the conversation started last year and then they sort of started diving in, if we might see more of these. But because this caught specifically some preservation groups sort of off guard, and they really didn't get, during 45 days, you don't really get a huge amount of time to wrap your mind around things. There may be some traction to look at changing this year. So if you have a land preservation program in your office, or if you work closely with some of these preservation groups, this might be something that they talk to you about or have questions about. And really, we're not sure where it came from, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see some edits in the coming sessions about this. Art?
After we passed the 1st of July, the legislative work way to the state code. You're looking for it to state code, are you more likely to find it like it's 15.2 or 58?
Most everything I talk about is going to be in 15.2. That's going to be your and it's currently, everything's been signed by the governor. It's in acts of assembly. You can easily find it right now, but come July 1, when you go to LIS to look up these bills, most of what I'm talking about you're going to find in 15.2.
Well, like freedom of information,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the things.
And actually, this is in a taxation section.
Glad that section 58.
But on the macro level, most of everything I cover is going to be that. There was actually quite a few changes in taxation and procurement. A lot of things this year that are interesting for Virginia localities. I'm not going to touch on those, but they are in the key bills report, so I encourage you to take a look at that. And also, if you're either probably a part of VACO or VML, their staff is very knowledgeable about things that went on related to finance and money this year. So reach out to them. The last item I have listed here is if you become in dispute on a conservation easement between the easement holder and someone else, that can now be resolved by using the Administrative Dispute Resolution Act. So I know you guys were already using that. So now here's one more thing that you can use it for. We have seen, and you in your locality have probably seen several of these. Maybe it's the second owner who is now dealing with the conservation easement. They purchased it. I don't know if they followed that due diligence we talked about earlier, but then they have some restrictions that they want to have undone. And this is happening kind of as people are taking advantage of the conservation easements and the tax credits. But when it moves on to that second owner, a lot of times, there have been quite a few disputes. And so this sort of put that out there that, okay, we have this set up that people can take advantage of using. More on land use and planning. So this year they opened up farm winery legislation again, and we all got a little bit uneasy, because if you went through that a few years ago, you should be uneasy. But it's actually, I think, fairly positive. The percentage of alcohol you can produce on a farm winery used to be 18%, and that's now been increased to 21%. So as you're traveling the back roads to all of these farm wineries around the Commonwealth, you now will have sampled things of potentially higher alcohol content. So I'm not sure how that ties land use and transportation, or if that's what the administration was thinking of, but anyway. Another item, Senate Bill 1257. Years ago, when they started putting in these provisions to, I think it's referred to as deal with the housing crisis, they put several dates in place, and one of them was this date of July 1, 2017 for extensions. This bill for cash proffers on residential construction removed that date and didn't put another one in. So some of you may be familiar with, you used to be able to collect cash proffer at building permit stage, or at a different time. But this language is specific to a final inspection and CO, and that looks like that's going to carry forward. And some localities got a little bit creative, and they had a developer proffer that they would still do at a building permit stage, and that didn't work out for them. So it's going to be at CO that you can require to ask for it. Now, if they give it to you earlier and you didn't require it, I don't know. Talk to your attorney. But this took out that sunset and didn't put a new date back in. This is the first time we've seen that on some of the other language. As we get closer to 2017, the first extension, I think the housing crisis was going to be over in 2014. And then in their wisdom, they decided the housing crisis was probably going to last a couple more years, and they made it this 2017 date. You'll see that in the text several places. This is the first one that they've completely taken out altogether. The others grandfathered a lot of those old plats and, more importantly, site plans that hadn't gotten off the ground. We're definitely keeping an eye on what's going to happen with those, what they're going to do with the date, because we've got things hanging around that were approved as of, I think, end of 99, beginning of 2000 that have been vested, still vested through 2017. Are they going to extend that again? I mean, is the housing crisis over? How will we know when it's over? I don't know. This will all happen in the General Assembly because they've got a crystal ball, maybe. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But this is the first time that we've seen that date just completely be removed. And I don't think they're going to be able to do that on that other legislation where we talked about those site plans that have been vested since 2000. We can't vest them in perpetuity, but when will we stop? That's a good question. It's definitely something that we're keeping an eye on at APA Virginia. Senate Bill 1355 requires that local planning commission action on a plat or a site plan, if your planning commission reviews those, must occur within 60 days, and that's regardless of population size. So if you pull up the bill language, it used to have a sentence at the beginning that said, for jurisdictions with over, I think it was 90,000 in population, and then it had this language. And they just struck that population size requirement. I have a feeling most of our commissions are already being fairly timely with their reviews, but this sort of just, put a period on that and said, all localities that have the subdivision, the planning commission actions, you must occur within 60 days. So I encourage you to take a look at that text and see how it may or may not impact the way that you're doing reviews. Again, localities still have a lot of discretion because it has to be a complete application, and as some of us know, you don't always get that complete application that comes in on the first time, and so that doesn't necessarily start that 60-day clock. So take a look at it, take a look at how you're working with your commission, and also take a look at what your county attorney says, and if you need to do any code changes. Some localities have specific language in their code that may have said 90 days if you need to take a look at doing some changes. This is one of those that could really impact you, depending on how your locality. In a lot of localities, plats and site plans don't go before the Board or Commission because they're administrative acts anyway, so your subdivision agent and zoning administrator are usually handling it, but a lot of you do review them at commission level. So just take a look at how that might impact you. So I think we called it here last year. I know that one of the gatherings we had with LUEP, when we always at the end, we talk about what's next, what are we going to have next year. We had the farm wineries, last year we had the farm breweries, and this year we got farm distilleries. So the text on this is, it tracks along with that other legislation. manufacturing no more than a certain amount. In this case, it's 36,000 gallons of spirits, and that's per calendar year. This is interesting. Located on a farm in the Commonwealth on land zoned agricultural and owned or leased by the distillery or its owner. There is language in state code that defines what a farm is, and your locality is certainly can make their own definition or use that, but that on a farm really helps with some of the other legislation that's been in place, the farm wineries and the farm breweries. Make sure that you're dealing with bona fide operations and not someone who said, this is zoned ag, let's do a brewery here or a distillery or whatever other items, agritourism. You can't just throw it there. There does have to be this nexus, and so administratively your staff can take a look at this. And the last item was it has to grow agricultural products on the farm that are used in the manufacture. This is something that has, been mentioned in the winery and brewery legislation. It's interesting to see how this will play out. Distilling, from what I understand, is not as turnkey as maybe some of the other processing of alcoholic beverages, so it may not be quite the proliferation, but because of the success of farm wineries and farm breweries, it very well could be. Some localities have already embraced it and dealt with it zoning wise, but in this case, if you have your agriculturally zoned property that is currently functioning as a farm or will function as a farm and grows agricultural products that are used, then now we have sort of this right to distill. Yeah.
There's no restriction for having a winery for
As long as you are using the agricultural products of your bona fide farm, you could actually have all three. Plus, you could throw in an agritourism event with it. I mean, maybe you guys are going to paddle or have any of those exciting. You guys know what I'm talking about. So is it a 5K mud run? That's now an agritourism event. I've heard some really interesting ones, and actually we have a really interesting one right now in Montgomery County. But people are getting very creative, and they're seeing what's been put in state code, and they're coming to the office knowing that in a lot of cases they don't even have to get a permit. I mean, we usually send them to E&S and stormwater because that wasn't exempted by the code. But if they're not doing a lot of paving or a lot of site disturbance, in some cases, this is a fairly easy thing to just slip right into. So we'll see what happens. We just talked about we increased the percentage of alcohol you can do at your farm winery. Now we've got distilleries. If they're in close proximity to one another, if they're tied to some of these larger events, the transportation, the land use, there's so many things tied into these. I think this legislation also tracks similar to the other that talks about you can't have sort of a commercial kitchen on site. So it really tries to separate that out. But we all have seen what happens. They bring in catered food, bring in a food truck. Lots of things are happening to proliferate this, good, bad, or indifferent. Now that's up to each locality to decide. But I wonder about those unintended consequences, which as a planner, we just can't help but thinking about that health, safety, and welfare. We've got more traffic on these narrow roads. We've got more potential for conflict. We've got, a lot of different issues, and we'll just have to see how this kind of fleshes out. And do you have a question? So here's a really interesting thing that I heard the other day, because I was talking to someone in a locality about our unique situation that we're having in Montgomery County. I thought it was unique. And they said, well, that has to be sprinklered, so how can they even do that out there? Because there's not good access, there's no public water available, and sprinklering off a well can obviously be very problematic and usually stops it. But that is tied to your building code, and that, again, can be specific to even though it's a uniform statewide building code, building officials deal with things differently in different localities. I think we all know that. So that's something that I think could be locality specific still. I don't think it was discussed either, by the way. Yes, ma'am?
I just didn't hear the question.
Oh, her question was there any discussion about how the building code impacts these buildings. Because building code will exempt ag, in certain cases, we're pretty familiar with that. But in this case, if it's events or if it's distillery, there is some language that talks about sprinklering specifically. And I don't know that anything has come out as a model on it. I think it's going to be looked at how your official looks at building code, your building official. Zoning wise, you're still going to have your basic regulations there. You're going to have your setbacks, height. That's interesting. Height, and things like that. But basically, your permits are what they are. This is Jonah's desktop, everyone. Yeah, he's going to get on that before it gets embarrassing. Thanks, Jen. Oh, okay. That's not so embarrassing. Did someone else have a question? You see?
We understand from ABC that there's no minimum amount of ag product on site that's qualified.
We also understand that there is a maximum amount of tasting in terms of number of households. And it's a separate licensure for distillers, so it's a little more strict than the winery.
Yes, and that statement was related to ABC regulations in Virginia, which are pretty strong and in full force. But I do think they have different tasting requirements, is what she stated, and also, what was the other item? The no minimum amount. So that minimum amount's pretty important because anybody who was here last year, you could be having deja vu. We talked about for the farm breweries, you have to grow something that you use in beer production. Well, I like craft beer. And one of the things I like, Hardywood has a great craft beer that they infuse. It's a white, and they use berries and infuse it in there. Wild Wolf has a similar one. You grow a couple berries on your lot, and you've used that agricultural product. The same language is in there about farm. So I encourage everyone to take a look at that, because what we're looking at is we're using the state code language related to farm or ranch, I think is how it's defined, and it says certain things that it needs to meet. And using that, we've worked on a modified permit, not necessarily a text change, but a permit that takes a look at how do you ensure that it's a bona fide farm, check. How do you ensure that health, safety, and welfare items are being met? Because the state code does say we're allowed to regulate those. You can't be more stringent on noise than you are in other places. So that's one of the things you have to look at, because sometimes these are going to have an event tied to them at the farms. But I have to say it's depends on your locality. We've got an issue that'll be going before the Planning Commission in Montgomery County next month to talk about an issue that, unfortunately, I'm basically saying what I'm saying to you guys. We really can't regulate this, but we thought we'd tell you about it because we're getting the phone calls and we're hearing about it. And if you don't like it, we really encourage you to talk to your state legislator, because this came out of the wisdom of Richmond, and they took away a lot of local authority. But it does put some of those safety items in there, and we are taking a look at where people can park, making sure emergency vehicles can get in and out. Is there anybody here from Albemarle County? They have some great language in their code that we've looked at, and if we look to do a text amendment, we'd probably try to mirror some of that. They got out ahead of that.
An agricultural district and not just zoned agriculture.
So that's one of the things. That's one of the things that we've run into in several sessions. The summary for this text says zoned agriculture, but I didn't go into the full text to see. But typically what they do, and this was similar on wineries and breweries, a lot of us have districts that are our ag districts, but we don't call them ag. In Gloucester County specifically, we use rural countryside. We have a different name. York County does too. If you guys follow anything that they're doing there, they're always trying to be creative. They allow ag in the district, but it's not called agriculture. That language is meant to address that, so that people can't sort of use it as a loophole. The General Assembly wanted to be really clear: if you allow agriculture in the district, you allow this. And I didn't pull up that, I'll pull it up on my phone after this. But the summary only said zoned agriculture. But typically if it tracks the other legislation, it is, or you allow ag in the district. So, okay, I'm going to move along. I don't want to get us off time, and I don't have too much left to say. The one item we looked at for comprehensive plans this year is specific to localities in the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. They have to incorporate in the next scheduled update and in all subsequent reviews of their comp plan strategies to combat projected relative sea level rise and recurrent flooding. So this follows that pattern I was telling you about with this recurrent flooding subcommittee that's been doing work. This was one of their ideas. They went ahead and put it in this session. This is going to be really interesting because there are localities within the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission that may not even believe in sea level rise. I'm just going to put that out there. I think everyone believes in recurrent flooding. That's a terminology that I think people do wrap their head around. But projected sea level rise is something of a debate anywhere you go, really. But within that PDC, this is sort of a mandate that might be sticky as they move forward and start doing it. So we'll keep our eye on that. Transportation, I actually am going to sort of breeze through this. One of the things I wanted to do was another plug for the APA state conference this year in Norfolk. You will hear a better version of this presentation because I'll have my team of legislative consultants and some guests that come in, and we do a panel of this, and they offer a lot of their background of working on the bills and working on the Hill during the session. So it's a little more exciting than just me talking. But we have a group of a transportation track, and that in and of itself is great. But we have a keynote speaker, Nick Donahue, who's the Deputy Secretary of Transportation in the Commonwealth, and he actually worked for the administration that adopted 3202, if you guys remember that fantastic legislation. And he's going to talk about how HB2, which everyone is talking about right now across the state. Transportation is sort of in this weird place. And one of the things that we noticed this year, and I just have those two things on HB 1887, it had that generic title of Commonwealth Transportation Board membership funding and reporting. It's a lengthy bill, but if you go through and look at it, you'll notice a line here, an added word there. It was really meant to tweak what had been adopted, and there was a strong effort this year during the session to keep in place what had been adopted. I think we all know what got adopted for changing the funding, transportation funding structure was a pretty big deal. A lot of folks took heat for it in their districts. Some folks didn't get reelected because of some of the changes. So, it was a pretty big deal, and there was a kind of a bipartisan effort to say, let's keep this in place because we want to realize capturing this funding. Because right away we actually kind of lost money, or the funding's not coming in. And in some cases, this funding that is in place through this continued legislation, we won't actually see funded until 2021. I mean, that's big for the General Assembly to be that forward thinking. And I don't mean that in a negative way. What I mean is typically they deal with session to session on a very micro level. This took some political will to get it moving, and all of us who are dealing with how we're scoring our projects and what it qualifies for and all of the unknowns. If you come to Norfolk, you'll get to hear from Nick Donahue, and I'm sure come with your questions. I'm sure he's going to be willing to talk about some of those specifics because we're all sort of in this unknown place with transportation funding legislation and how our projects are going to be scored and things. So it was a lengthy bill, but it only got those 3 lines there. The item 1402 is something that cities and towns deal with regularly. It's regarding your funding from the state on your moving lanes, on your travel lanes. And if localities are doing things to incorporate other modes of transportation, bike and ped infrastructure specifically, you lost your funding. That lane didn't count. So this is a first step, and I think we're going to see more. The first step is that cities and towns won't see reductions if they're changing those moving lanes to transit only. That's the first step. But you'll notice the city of Richmond was allowed to convert 20 moving lanes to bike lanes and not lose its payment. And if anyone knows, that Richmond obviously has a lot of bike things going on. They're hosting a gigantic bike event soon. And this obviously is going to be huge economic development-wise, and I think maybe they're using them as an example, as a template, as a starting point to see if this could work. But you'll notice that the last part of this bill says the Secretary of Transportation needs to create an appropriate maintenance formula for bike lanes. So, okay, maybe we don't do like to like. Maybe you get 50% funding if you're doing these bike lanes. So if you're in a city or a town, this impacts your maintenance funding, and it's worth taking a look at. This is something that APA Virginia brought to the table and we started talking about last year. It's hard to get traction because of all the other transportation funding things that are going on right now. But this is a great starting point, and I do feel like as a chapter we're going to try to build on this in the coming year, because VDOT, and particularly the Commonwealth Transportation Board, we all know, talks about how important other modes of transportation are, but when it comes down to it, they weren't funding them the same way. They weren't really looking at them the same way, and this is a big step in the right direction to make sure that those things are aligned. I thought House Bill 2391 was fairly interesting. A lot of us know that a lot of our unpaved roads have been paved because that was kind of the only funding that's been out there for a while. This language says that same percentage is going to go to unpaved roads, but not just for paving. You can also use it to improve if it's a qualifying unpaved road. You can use it for paving or improvement. That made it a little more general. I think will give localities and VDOT in your locality some leeway. But interestingly enough, it doesn't take effect until next July, which is probably okay because all of us have really kind of looked at our 6-year plans and stuff already probably. So that's just, I think, a positive thing for localities to think about. And 1886 talks about public-private transportation. It charges an advisory committee to review all VDOT and DRPT projects to see if there really is a public interest. Are they doing it because this is just where they want to spend money, or is this something that we really need this public-private partnership for, and that can be meaningful? So this committee and the structure of the committee is in the text of the bill. So if you're interested in how that's set up, I encourage you to take a look at that. There is one item for Northern Virginia, because I know we have some Northern Virginia folks here. So traffic's an issue in Northern Virginia. I don't know if anyone knows about that. It requires the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority's regional transportation plan to make reducing congestion its primary objective to all localities that are located in Planning District 8. And localities in Planning District 8 have to report inconsistencies between that plan and their comp plan. So this is sort of a, come on guys, let's see what we can do sort of effort. A plan, we all love our plans, but I don't know if it's going to mean that they get some additional funding and things because of it. We'll see how it goes, but they're really sort of taking a stand on that congestion up there in Northern Virginia. So just to wrap things up, I always like to put out there a few things that we think could happen in 2016, but I always like to hear from anybody if you've got a hot button issue. And since we don't have tons of time, my contact information is there on the bottom. If you think of something that you want to email me about or tell me what's going on in your locality, the chapter is working on its legislative platform now. We work year-round on legislation. You're either during session or you're getting ready for the next session. I mean, it's constantly moving.